They say we are standing at the doorway of the age of Aquarius, a time when old structures are collapsing and something new is quietly being born. For generations, success was measured by how hard you worked, how high you climbed, how many titles you earned, and how much you owned. But those old rules are starting to feel hollow. More and more people are realizing that intuition, creativity, and authenticity hold far more power than endless hustle, constant grind, or the approval of others. It feels as if the world itself is whispering to us, stop pretending, start becoming. Carl Jung sensed this long before the rest of us. A century ago, when society was busy worshipping machines, factories, and productivity, Jung was listening to something softer and deeper, the voice of the soul. He was not measuring stock markets or designing business models, he was exploring dreams, archetypes, and symbols buried in the unconscious. And in doing so, he discovered a truth that still feels radical today: you are not your past, your wounds, or your failures. You are not the story others told about you. You are what you choose to become. Think about what that means. If the story of your life until now has been about survival, sacrifice, or silencing your true self, what happens when you stop living inside that story? What happens when you decide to write a new one? Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming your truest self. He believed it was not only a path of healing but also a path of creation, a way of unlocking a hidden energy that could flow into art, innovation, relationships, and even financial abundance. But here lies the paradox. Most of us were taught to succeed by abandoning the very parts of ourselves that carried our deepest joy. Maybe you loved singing, but someone told you it wasn't practical. Maybe you dreamed of writing, but you buried it under a real career. Maybe you had strange or risky ideas, but you pushed them away for fear of being judged. Jung gave a name to these forgotten pieces: the shadow. But the shadow isn't evil, nor is it a monster to be feared. It is simply unlived life, the parts of you that never had the chance to breathe. And often, the very things you've hidden are the keys to your freedom. There was once a woman who seemed to live the dream many envy. She was a lawyer at a prestigious firm, respected, secure, admired by her family and peers. From the outside, her life looked perfect. But on the inside, she felt like she was slowly suffocating. Her true joy did not come from the courtroom or the paycheck. It came from something she had always kept secret: drawing whimsical characters, doodling strange, mystical figures, and writing magical little stories that made her feel alive. For years she dismissed this side of herself as childish and unimportant. She told herself it was a hobby, something she could never take seriously. And so she buried it, hiding behind the polished image of the successful lawyer. But the shadow never stays silent. It whispers. It stirs. It waits for you to listen. One night, drained from another long day, she opened an old sketchbook. She told herself it was only for stress relief, nothing more. But as she let her pen move across the page, she felt something she had almost forgotten: a sense of aliveness, of joy, of wholeness. Hours slipped by unnoticed. The characters returned. The stories unfolded. And for the first time in years, she felt like herself again. At first she kept it secret, afraid of being judged. Then she began sharing her drawings online. To her surprise, people loved them. What she had treated as silly, others found enchanting, refreshing, and deeply human. Little by little, the very things she had been taught to hide began to guide her toward freedom. She left the law firm. She published her first illustrated book. She built a new life, not from pretending to be what others expected, but from embracing who she truly was. In stepping out of her shadow, she did more than change her own story: she inspired countless others to imagine what hidden part of themselves might also be waiting to come alive. This is what Jung was pointing to. The pieces of you that you hide, the passions you've buried, the truths you've been too afraid to live, are not your weakness. They are your unlived life. And the moment you dare to embrace them, you don't just transform yourself, you open a doorway for others to transform as well. Burnout has a strange way of stripping a person down to their most honest self. For years she carried the identity of a successful lawyer like a shield, convincing the world, and often herself, that she was fulfilled. Every morning she dressed in tailored suits, walked into tall glass buildings, and played the part she thought she was meant to play. On the outside, she looked like she had everything anyone could want: money, prestige, respect. But on the inside, she felt her spirit dimming. The weight of endless hours, constant deadlines, and the pressure to always perform left her feeling hollow. Her soul whispered for something more, but she pushed it aside because that voice didn't fit the script she was told to follow. The breaking point didn't come in a single dramatic moment. It was slower, quieter, like a crack spreading through glass. Small things piled up: the exhaustion she could no longer shake, the emptiness she felt after each courtroom victory, the nagging ache that this life wasn't really hers. Eventually, the walls she had built around herself collapsed under the weight of burnout. For the first time in years, she let herself listen to the part of her she had buried. Almost instinctively, she picked up a pen. Not to make money, not to strategize, not even to prove anything to anyone. She drew simply because it made her feel alive. What began as harmless play became a doorway. Sketch by sketch, doodle by doodle, she uncovered the artist she had hidden for so long. At first, it was her private rebellion, a secret escape. But when she began sharing her drawings online, people responded. They didn't dismiss her work as childish. They saw it as magical, funny, and strangely healing. Her little webcomic spread far beyond what she imagined. Within 2 years, what she once treated as a silly indulgence had turned into a flourishing career. Today she earns more than she ever did in law, but the real reward isn't the money, it's the fact that she wakes up with energy and joy, no longer pretending to live someone else's story. The shadow she had buried, the artist inside her, became her greatest partner. This is what Carl Jung meant by individuation. It is the process of becoming whole, of bringing into the light the parts of ourselves we once rejected. It is what happens when you stop forcing yourself to play the role you think you should, and instead choose to embody who you truly are. In today's world, that kind of alignment is more powerful than any quick fix, hack, or formula. Because true value is no longer created through labor alone. It is created through authenticity, through showing up in a way that no one else can, by being yourself. But this journey doesn't always begin with dramatic leaps. Most of the time, it starts with something smaller, almost invisible. It begins with a question. What part of me have I been ignoring? What dream have I been too afraid to admit? The answers don't always arrive loudly, but when they do, you feel a flicker of energy, a spark in your chest. That spark is your shadow calling you home. The next step is not to turn it into a business plan or force it into success. The next step is to simply explore it, not for money, not for recognition, but for truth. Recognition and success often come later, because what the world hungers for now is realness, originality, and depth, and those things can only come from the unlived parts of yourself. As you take those small steps, something begins to shift. Work that once felt tolerable starts to feel unbearable, like a cage you can no longer sit in. Simple creative acts, writing a page, sketching a character, playing a song, suddenly feel essential to your well-being. Synchronicities begin to appear, chance meetings, opportunities that seem to fall into place, conversations that feel strangely timed. You begin to meet people who don't compete with your mask but encourage your authenticity, people who reflect your true self back to you. Slowly, quietly, your life begins to reorient itself, not around who you thought you had to be, but around who you really are. Jung never promised a quick path to riches. He wasn't teaching us how to outwork or outhustle the world. He was teaching us how to live fully, to integrate what we have lost, to recover what we have hidden. And the irony is that in today's world, where people are starving for meaning, living fully has become the most valuable wealth of all. Authenticity itself has become a currency. The world we are leaving behind measured worth by exhaustion, sacrifice, and struggle. For centuries, people were told that to succeed they had to work longer, compete harder, and sacrifice themselves in the process. But that old story is falling apart. Machines and AI already handle much of the labor that once consumed human lives. Audiences are no longer impressed by surface-level perfection, they crave truth. Consumers are no longer passive buyers, they are creators, storytellers, seekers of meaning. And meaning has become the new marketplace. What people long for now is resonance, not polish. They want to feel something real. They want to know they are not alone in their struggles, their wounds, their doubts. And the more you allow yourself to show up as your full self, with your quirks, your imperfections, your hidden passions, the more magnetic you become. Integration expands you, and that expansion radiates outward as energy others can't help but feel. In this new era, consciousness itself has become a form of wealth. The old system told us we had to shrink to fit, to obey, to sacrifice silently just to earn our place. But that illusion is dissolving. The moment you stop twisting yourself to fit into the system, you realize you were never meant to fit, you were meant to create from within it. Your story becomes your strategy. Your energy becomes your economy. Money stops being a prize given to those who suffer in silence and instead begins to flow naturally when you choose to live fully. Look at your own life. Every failure, every heartbreak, every wound you thought would ruin you has been shaping you, chiseling you, guiding you toward the self you were always meant to become. The question is no longer whether you can work harder or prove yourself more. The real question is, what part of you is still waiting to be lived? What shadow have you buried that, once embraced, could transform not only your life but also the way you share your gifts with the world? Because in this new age, alignment is not just a personal luxury. It is the foundation of true wealth. She used to believe her story was nothing but a weight she had to carry. Every failure, every heartbreak, every shameful secret felt like a scar that made her less worthy of love, of opportunity, of being seen. So she buried them. She polished the outside, smiled when she was supposed to, collected achievements the world told her mattered, and hid the rest. But what she didn't know then is that the world itself was changing. People were growing tired of perfect masks. They weren't looking for flawless heroes anymore, they were longing for voices that felt real, for stories that admitted the struggle but still pointed toward light. The first time she spoke her truth, her voice trembled. She expected silence, maybe even rejection. Instead, people leaned closer. They didn't see weakness, they saw themselves. Her honesty didn't push them away, it drew them in. What she thought made her unworthy became the very thing that built connection. She realized then that the shadow, the part of her life she had worked so hard to hide, was not her enemy. It was her bridge. Survivors became authors, therapists became podcasters, ordinary people began turning their scars into stories, communities, courses, books. The shadow whispered, "No one will care." But the shadow lied. People cared because it freed them. And as she shared more, she noticed something magical, doors began to open. Opportunities appeared where none existed before. Sometimes small, sometimes sudden, but always reminding her that her story was no longer just hers. It had become medicine for others. The old world would have dismissed this. For generations, worth was measured in diplomas, titles, and letters after your name. Respect was granted through institutions, credentials, and external approval. But a degree can't guarantee wisdom. A title doesn't prove self-knowledge. If you've lived through pain and transformed it, you are already a guide. You don't need a stamp of approval from an institution, life itself has already initiated you. Your story, your resilience, your journey, that is your authority. People don't follow resumes anymore, they follow voices that feel true. They notice if your presence feels grounded, if your words carry the weight of lived experience. That's what builds trust now. And this is why sharing your healing is not exploitation. It's not about selling your wounds. It's about honoring them. It's about realizing that the thing you thought would break you is the very thing someone else needs to hear in order to rise. Your private pain becomes a public map. And when you share it, you not only guide others, you deepen your own growth. Every time you teach what you've lived, your own transformation roots itself deeper inside you. Something shifts when you stop hiding and start integrating. Suddenly, the money, the recognition, the opportunities you used to chase begin to flow toward you. Not because you forced them, but because you're living in alignment. Wholeness has its own magnetism. And people can feel it. This is not just about economy, it's about psychology. We've stepped out of an age where worth was measured by struggle, exhaustion, and survival. For centuries, success meant proving yourself through sacrifice, long hours, endless competition, pushing until you broke. But that world is crumbling. Machines and algorithms are already taking over efficiency.
They can outperform us in speed and precision. But they cannot replicate what only humans carry: soul. And that changes everything.
In this new era, presence itself is power.
Wholeness has become wealth.
The most valuable thing you can offer isn't your ability to grind harder than anyone else, it's your ability to be real, to be whole, to embody your truth.
Authenticity has become currency. Consciousness has become the new economy.
She once thought her scars ruined her. Now she knows they are her gold. Every experience she once wanted to erase became a piece of her medicine. And when she allowed herself to share it, she discovered that the world wasn't waiting for her perfection, it was waiting for her wholeness.
And that's the same for you. The very thing you're hiding might be the thing that saves someone else. The story you carry in silence could be the story that gives another person hope.
And when you step into that truth, you realize wealth is no longer about accumulation.
It's about alignment.
Money stops being something you chase, it becomes something that follows the energy of authenticity. Because in the age of Aquarius, the old rules are gone. The new wealth is not built from grinding yourself down but from daring to show up whole.
And the question that remains is simple: what part of your shadow is still waiting to be lived?
Carl Jung knew something the world wasn't ready to hear. While factories were roaring and people measured worth by money, power, and machines, he turned his attention to the soul. He saw what others missed: humanity's greatest hidden treasure wasn't buried in gold mines or stored in banks, it was buried in the psyche itself. Deep inside every person lives the shadow, the parts we push away, the parts we hide, the parts we deny. For most of us, the shadow feels like weakness, shame, or failure.
But Jung understood it differently.
He saw it as a reservoir of creativity, energy, and truth.
What feels like baggage is actually gold. What feels like a curse is the very thing that can set us free. But no treasure is ever left unguarded.
Standing at the door to this hidden wealth are guardians, archetypes that live inside us. They are not enemies, but patterns, old stories we carry.
The first is the good student. This archetype has good intentions.
It wants to learn, to do well, to prove itself ready. But it whispers lies that sound safe: don't move until you're perfect.
Don't share until you've mastered it. Someone else knows better. Wait for their approval.
And so many people get stuck here, spending years collecting certificates, degrees, and courses, waiting for the day they finally feel worthy enough to begin.
But that day never comes. The truth is, mastery isn't a prerequisite, it's the result of showing up.
Growth comes from stumbling, learning, and daring to step into the arena before you feel ready.
Abundance doesn't arrive because you're flawless. It arrives when you are bold enough to be real.
Then comes the silent healer. Gentle, giving, endlessly compassionate, this archetype feels noble at first.
It gives and gives and gives. It whispers, how could I ever ask for money when people are suffering? Healing should be free.
And so it pours itself out, but slowly burns away its own life force. The silent healer confuses poverty with purity, forgetting that energy cannot flow in one direction forever. Without exchange, even love burns out. The lesson here is not that healing should be sold like a product, but that money is circulation, it keeps energy moving, it sustains the gift, it allows the healer to serve more people without losing themselves. When the silent healer learns to receive as well as give, their work expands instead of collapses. The third archetype is the starving artist. For centuries, society has romanticized this figure: the poet scribbling in candlelight with an empty stomach, the painter suffering in an attic, the musician playing in the streets. This archetype insists that real art comes from struggle, and that money destroys authenticity.
But this, too, is a distortion. Suffering can create depth, but abundance can create freedom.
Imagine the poet who travels the world, bringing new landscapes into her verses. Imagine the painter with canvases big enough to hold his visions. Imagine the musician with the freedom to spend hours perfecting his sound instead of begging for rent.
Abundance doesn't dull creativity, it liberates it.
The starving artist must learn that joy, not pain, is the true fuel of expression.
The fourth is the invisible one. This archetype doesn't lack gifts, it hides them.
Long ago it learned that being seen was unsafe. Maybe it was criticized, mocked, or punished.
Maybe it was told to stay small to survive.
So it hides, scrolling in the background, hoping that someone will magically discover its value.
But invisibility is not safety, it is self-erasure. The invisible one must learn that stepping into the light is not arrogance. It is service. People cannot connect with what they cannot see. The moment it steps forward, awkward and afraid, it realizes the truth. The world doesn't reject authenticity, it longs for it.
And then there is the imitator.
This archetype is clever. It studies what works.
It copies the voices of the successful, mimics the strategies, follows the formulas. On the outside, it looks polished and safe.
But deep down, something feels hollow. Because no imitation, no matter how shiny, can replace authenticity.
People may admire the surface, but they feel the lack of soul.
The imitator's deepest fear is that its real self isn't enough. But that fear is the doorway.
The moment it dares to stop copying and starts creating from its own strangeness, its own scars, its own fire, it transforms. Suddenly, it is no longer a copy but a signal, a beacon that draws others in. Authenticity creates resonance, and resonance creates abundance. These 5 guardians stand before everyone who seeks their shadow treasure. And each one carries the same truth: your abundance is not blocked by the outside world, but by the stories you've believed inside. The good student waits for permission, but abundance begins with boldness. The silent healer gives without receiving, but abundance requires exchange. The starving artist glorifies struggle, but abundance flourishes in joy.
The invisible one hides, but abundance requires visibility. The imitator copies, but abundance is born in authenticity.
The moment you face these archetypes, the shadow begins to open. The treasure you thought was hidden behind shame and failure is revealed as your deepest source of wealth. The baggage you thought held you back becomes your power. And suddenly, you see what Jung saw long ago, that the shadow isn't the darkness to fear, it's the gold you were always meant to claim. There comes a time when you begin to notice the patterns inside you were not truths, but stories you've carried for so long that they feel like truths. The good student who tells you not to share until you're perfect, the silent healer who convinces you that giving without receiving is noble, the starving artist who whispers that only struggle makes art real, the invisible one who hides because being seen feels unsafe, the imitator who copies because originality feels too risky. Each of them lives inside you. At one point, these voices may have protected you. They helped you survive in a world that demanded obedience, sacrifice, and sameness.
But survival is not the same as living.
And if you listen too long to these archetypal voices, they turn into cages. They keep you waiting, giving, starving, hiding, copying, when what you are meant to do is live. Carl Jung saw this long before our time. He understood that these inner characters aren't evil, they're archetypes, ancient stories that play themselves out inside all of us. They show up as obstacles, not because they want to destroy us, but because they want to teach us. The good student must learn that mastery doesn't come before the leap, it comes after.
The silent healer must learn that receiving is just as sacred as giving. The starving artist must learn that joy doesn't corrupt creativity, it feeds it.
The invisible one must learn that visibility is not punishment, it is freedom.
And the imitator must learn that their own strange, unpolished, authentic self is more magnetic than any polished copy could ever be. The moment you recognize them as stories, something powerful shifts. You realize you don't have to keep repeating them. You can rewrite them.
The good student becomes the courageous teacher, sharing not because they are perfect, but because they are willing to grow in public. The silent healer becomes the empowered guide, knowing that when they allow energy and money to flow back toward them, their service becomes sustainable, and their impact multiplies. The starving artist becomes the thriving creator, no longer chained to suffering but free to let abundance expand their vision. The invisible one becomes the lighthouse, shining naturally, quietly but unmistakably, so others can find their way. And the imitator becomes the original, standing out not by trying to, but simply by being fully themselves. This is the prophecy Jung hinted at, and it's unfolding now in what many call the Age of Aquarius. For generations, worth was measured by labor, exhaustion, and how much you could prove through sacrifice. Money was a prize given to those who endured the grind. But the world has shifted.
Machines can do the labor now. AI can mimic efficiency. Status and credentials don't guarantee wisdom anymore.
People are no longer impressed by polish alone, they crave resonance, authenticity, and presence.
The new currency isn't perfection. It's coherence when your inner life and outer life align. Think about your own life. How many times have you dimmed yourself to stay safe?
Maybe as a child you showed too much of yourself, and someone laughed, scolded, or turned away. Maybe later, you spoke your truth and it was dismissed, mocked, or even used against you. So you learned to shrink. You hid your brilliance. You played it safe. And in some ways, it worked. You avoided conflict. You blended in. But inside, a quiet ache grew. A part of you knew something was missing. That hidden self never disappeared. It stayed with you, whispering in restless nights, in moments of inspiration you brushed aside, in the deep pull you feel when you see someone else living fully. That invisible self has been storing energy, waiting for you. And when you finally let it rise, you realize visibility is not about shouting. It's about standing without shrinking. It's about allowing others to feel your presence. Like a candle in a dark room, you don't have to say a word, the entire space changes the moment you allow yourself to shine. And then there is the overgiver, the part of you that works too hard, gives too much, and hopes that someday, someone will notice all your effort and finally say you're enough. You stay late, say yes when you want to say no, push yourself past your limits in the name of generosity. But inside, you're exhausted. You're afraid that if you stop, people will leave, or love will disappear. Yet the truth is, real abundance doesn't come from depletion. It comes from overflow. When your own cup is full, when you give from fullness instead of emptiness, your giving becomes powerful. You don't have to prove your worth by breaking yourself. Your worth was never something to prove. It is something to embody. The moment you stop hiding, the moment you stop overgiving, the moment you stop copying others or starving yourself in the name of authenticity, you begin to feel something shift. At first, it's subtle. You set a boundary you never set before, and instead of losing people, you gain respect. You share a small piece of your truth, and someone thanks you for saying exactly what they needed to hear. You give yourself permission to rest, and suddenly new ideas flood in. Then, bigger shifts follow. The right people begin to notice you. Opportunities appear in places you didn't expect. Collaborations come together with ease. Money begins to flow not because you forced it, but because you finally aligned with yourself. It may look like magic, but it isn't. It's alignment. It's wholeness. It's you reclaiming the parts of yourself you once abandoned. This is the real work of individuation. Jung spoke of not just healing, but becoming. Not chasing abundance, but embodying it. Not striving endlessly to earn your worth, but realizing that the wealth you've been seeking has been inside you all along, waiting for the courage to be lived. And when you live it, you don't just change your own life. You become a light, a story, a presence that reminds others they can live too. Jung saw something coming that most of the world could not yet imagine. He lived in a time before smartphones, before social media, before machines could think for us. And yet, he knew. He knew that the greatest wealth humanity had was not locked in banks or buried in the earth, it was hidden inside us. He knew that the psyche itself was the true gold, that the shadows we ran from held the power we were starving for. He tried to tell us that our unlived parts, our fears, our doubts, our strange impulses, the voices we silenced, were not signs of weakness but wells of strength. What we called flaws, he called hidden treasures. What we thought of as baggage, he saw as energy waiting to be reclaimed. But he also knew there were guardians at the door. Archetypes, he called them. Not villains, but patterns. Universal roles, woven into all of us, that appear to protect us, but in reality keep us stuck until we learn what they came to teach. And those guardians are still alive in us today. They whisper in our minds. They shape our choices. They hold us back from stepping fully into our abundance. Maybe you've met the good student. That part of you that waits, that says, not yet. Don't share until you've perfected it. Don't act until you've mastered it. Don't step forward until someone else approves. The good student waits endlessly for permission that never comes, stuck in collecting books, courses, mentors, anything to avoid being seen as unready.
But mastery isn't born in waiting.
It's born in stumbling forward, in learning as you go, in letting yourself be seen in process. The moment you stop seeking approval and begin embodying what you already know, you unlock a doorway to abundance, not because you are flawless, but because you are real.
Or maybe you know the silent healer.
Gentle, compassionate, endlessly giving, but unable to receive.
This voice says, I can't charge. How could I ask for money when people are suffering? It romanticizes sacrifice, as if being poor somehow makes the healing purer. But slowly, quietly, it burns you out. Healing takes energy, time, life force. To give without receiving is to bleed yourself dry. The silent healer must learn that money is not corruption, it is circulation. It is the river that keeps the work alive.
Without it, the work collapses. With it, the work grows roots and wings.
And then there is the starving artist.
The image of the tortured genius, alone in an attic, surviving on scraps. For centuries, this archetype was glorified as if suffering itself was proof of authenticity. It tells us that money kills creativity, that ease destroys art. But suffering is not depth, it is distortion. Real artistry doesn't die in abundance. It flourishes. A poet who can travel, a painter who can afford giant canvases, a musician with freedom of time, these are not corrupted, they are liberated. Abundance does not dim art, it expands it. There is also the invisible one. The part of you that hides, not because you lack gifts, but because you fear being seen. Maybe once, long ago, visibility brought pain, criticism, rejection, even danger. So you learned to stay small, to stay safe, to let others shine while you remained in the shadows. And it worked, in a way you avoided risk. But invisibility is not protection. It is erasure. The invisible one must learn that being seen is not arrogance, it is service. People cannot resonate with what they cannot see. And when you step into the light, you discover the world does not punish you for being real. It welcomes you. And then comes the imitator. The part that believes originality is too dangerous, so it copies. It studies the successful, mimics their tone, borrows their formulas, tries to blend in. On the surface, it looks safe, polished. But deep down, people feel the dissonance. No matter how perfect the imitation, it cannot carry the resonance of truth. The imitator must face its deepest fear, that maybe its authentic self is enough. And when it finally dares to create from its own strangeness, its own fire, it stops being a copy and becomes a beacon. That is when magnetism happens. That is when wealth flows. These are not enemies. They are teachers. Each of them carries the same message: your abundance is not blocked by the world, it is blocked by the stories you've believed about yourself. The good student asks for permission, but abundance asks for boldness. The silent healer gives endlessly, but abundance asks for balance. The starving artist clings to struggle, but abundance asks for joy. The invisible one hides, but abundance asks for presence. The imitator copies, but abundance asks for authenticity. And when you finally see them for what they are, not truths, but stories, you take back your power. You rewrite them. You let the good student become the courageous teacher, learning and sharing as they go. You let the silent healer become the empowered guide, giving and receiving in equal measure. You let the starving artist become the thriving creator, making art fueled by freedom. You let the invisible one become the lighthouse, shining without apology. You let the imitator become the original, magnetic simply because they are real. This is the shift Jung foresaw. A time when the age of Aquarius would not be about chasing more, but about becoming whole. Where your story is your strategy, your presence is your product, and your alignment is your economy. Money is no longer the reward for grinding silently, it becomes the natural byproduct of living authentically. And the moment you bring home the parts of yourself you abandoned, the moment you integrate your shadow, you stop chasing abundance and start embodying it. That's when synchronicities multiply. That's when people lean in without you trying. That's when your life stops being a hustle and becomes a flow. But to get here, you must face the old wounds.
The moments when you learned it wasn't safe to shine. The times when your generosity was taken for granted. The seasons when invisibility felt like survival. You must see how much of your brilliance you've hidden, how many times you shrunk yourself, how often you've overgiven just to feel worthy. And then you must listen to the whisper inside, the one that never left, the one that has been storing energy, waiting for you to be ready. You don't need to shout to be seen. You don't need to grind yourself to the bone to be valuable. Your presence, when aligned, is enough. Think of a single candle in the dark, it doesn't scream, and yet the entire room changes when it is lit. That is you. That is the essence you carry. Abundance is not found in chasing, but in remembering. It is the realization that the source has always been within you. That every role you've played until now, the good student, the healer, the artist, the invisible one, the imitator, was just rehearsal. You were practicing lines written by others, wearing costumes that never fit, performing roles that weren't yours. And all along, another version of you waited in the wings. The version that doesn't apologize. The version that doesn't chase. The version that simply knows. And when you step into that version, something extraordinary happens. The reflection changes. Life mirrors back your wholeness. Opportunities arrive, not because you fought for them, but because you became available. Clients appear, collaborations unfold, inspiration flows. It looks like magic, but it's not. It's alignment. It's coherence. The old world, where worth was tied to exhaustion, is collapsing. Machines do the busy work now. Old industries are fading. People don't want perfection, they want resonance. They don't care about polished resumes, they care about presence that feels real. They care about stories that help them heal. And that is why alignment has become the new hustle. The moment you stand in your essence, scars, shadows, dreams, quirks, and all, you stop chasing. You begin attracting. Not because you forced it, but because you became whole. And yes, money comes too, but this time, it doesn't come as a price for suffering. It comes as the echo of truth. The more you embody your essence, the more life honors you back. And in that exchange, abundance flows, not as something you grip for, but as something you become. For years you learned how to hide in plain sight. You learned the lines you were given: be competent, be reliable, keep your head down, collect the credentials. You learned to measure success by other people's rulers, promotions, titles, paychecks. Most mornings you wore that armor because it made sense. It kept the lights on, it made your family proud, it kept the noise of doubt at a dull hum. On the outside the life looked clean and safe. Inside, something moved like a small, persistent animal, restless, hungry, awake. The slow breaking began with weariness. It started not with fireworks but with a tiny cracking, late nights where coffee tasted like grit, a dinner where you stared across the table and couldn't remember why you'd chosen this life, a weekend when even the small guilty pleasures felt like grit. The crack widened the night you found an old sketchbook and, with hands that trembled a little, drew for the sheer ridiculous joy of it. For the first time in years the pen felt honest in your fingers. It didn't ask for approval. It didn't want results. It simply wanted to move. You kept the drawings hidden at first. You told yourself they were private. You told yourself you had responsibilities. You told yourself you were not a real artist, not the kind who earned anything but grief. That was the good student's voice, caged in polite language: not yet. Study more. Master the craft. Don't step into the light until you are perfect. So you bought another book, another online course, convinced that preparation would guarantee safety. Meanwhile, the drawings gathered like seeds in the dark. One evening, tired and tender, you posted a single comic, just one page, a silly scene, nothing polished. You hit publish and went to make tea, expecting the usual small, hollow silence. Instead, the phone buzzed. A friend texted, then a stranger, then a small thread of messages from people who wrote, "This is exactly me." The avalanche was soft, then steady. People laughed. People cried. People wrote that they had been carrying the same thing in private and that your image had given them permission to breathe. The shadow you'd hidden became a bridge. That first reply was not money. It was recognition, something different and deeper. Money came later, but it arrived in a way that felt like justice rather than payoff. A bookstore owner asked if they could print your comic on postcards. A reader offered to commission a piece. A small community invited you to teach a workshop. Each of these came only after you had begun to show the honest, imperfect work you loved. There were obstacles on the way. The silent healer inside you still whispered that charging felt wrong. How could I take money when people are hurting? And at times you slid back into giving till you were bone thin. The starving artist fanned the old romantic lie that poverty equals depth, that struggle must be proof of devotion. You found yourself doing favors for others, working late for free, telling yourself the payoff would come once you had proven your purity. Slowly, painfully, you learned another rhythm. You learned that generosity and boundaries were not opposites. You learned that the work you loved required fuel, time, materials, rest, and that money was a practical way to keep that fuel burning. When you tried charging for a small class, your hands shook. A person signed up anyway, and after it finished they sent a long message about how it helped them stop hiding. When you allowed compensation to be part of your exchange, your capacity lengthened. The work didn't become mercenary, it became stable. Life taught you through simple, stubborn lessons. You watched what happened when you skipped creative practice for a month. Your mind tightened, colors dulled, new ideas stalled. You noticed what happened when you honored small rituals, a short walk before writing, a messy page of doodles with no plan, a quiet hour for thinking. Your nervous system settled. Creativity returned. People felt that steadiness. They came closer. You also met versions of yourself in the world, other lives that illustrated possibilities. There was the woman who left her corporate job to run neighborhood workshops and, in the same year, built a tiny publishing press, the gardener who turned ancestral recipes into a recipe zine and sold out his first print run, the teacher who started an honest newsletter that turned into a community-supported mentorship. None of them had started with a definitive plan. Most had started with a small, truthful act and followed the thread. There were dark nights, too. Old stories surfaced in public. Voices that once shamed you now found your posts and critiqued with brittle certainty. The invisible one in you curled back. You felt the old sting of being exposed. For a while you retreated. You remembered the child who'd tried to sing and was told to stop. But retreating only delayed the inevitable. Life was asking you to be steadier than fear. You practiced turning toward small audiences, then larger ones, choosing to stand when your knees wanted to buckle. Each time you did, your body learned a new language, presence. As the small successes gathered, your work began to mirror your life rather than devour it. You drafted a weekly rhythm that honored mornings for flow and afternoons for client work. You said no to projects that drained you and yes to collaborations that nourished your curiosity. You created offers that matched your energy, a short downloadable piece for casual fans, a focused workshop for curious learners, an intimate mentorship for people ready to go deep. People entered at different doors and moved with you as you evolved. The archetypes showed up in other ways. The imitator tempted you with quick paths, copy what's trending, mimic the popular voice, package the familiar. For a brief season you tried it, and the result felt like a costume. The audience was polite, but you felt hollow. When you returned to your own language, your own rhythms, favorite metaphors, the small eccentricities that made your work sound like you again, the response was different. It was deeper. It lasted. Money arrived, and it arrived oddly tender. At times it came as small, consistent payments that made the day-to-day possible. Other times it arrived as a surprising commission or an offer to speak. You learned to separate the panic of needing money from the value of what you offered. You learned to name prices without apology. When you did, people didn't recoil, they leaned forward. They wanted to invest in themselves through your work. You also learned the inner alchemy Jung hinted at, integration. The parts of yourself you'd smoothed over, anger, grief, longing, didn't vanish when you acknowledged them. They softened into texture. They gave your work weight. When you drew a character who carried a small wound, readers recognized a truth within themselves. When you wrote honestly about a failure, someone messaged to say they had been waiting to hear that exact sentence.
Your wounds became the map other people used to navigate their own.
Community formed.
It did not happen overnight, nor did it come as a single triumphant moment. It built in tiny interactions, a comment that turned into a conversation, a DM that became a real-life meeting, a workshop where strangers held each other's stories like fragile, sacred things.
People began to arrive not because you marketed perfectly, but because your presence resonated. They brought their friends. They supported your work.
They paid for your offerings.
They made space for your growth.
Still, you kept practicing the everyday habits that sustained you: clear margins in your calendar, a rule to never answer work messages after 8, a 5-minute morning sketch, a debt-free plan that kept money from ruling your nights. You kept learning to say no to flattering offers that would leave you exhausted, and yes to small projects that fed you. You kept returning to play not as a reward, but as the root of everything. Years from that first quiet sketch, you looked back and recognized a different shape to your life. The old script, the one handed down to you, had been rewritten. You were not only surviving, you were crafting. Your work was not a mask.
It was a mirror. People found you because you had dared to show your true edges.
The abundance that arrived, money, time, creative energy, felt different from any prize you had chased before. It felt like the fruit of a life aligned with itself.
None of this erased the hard parts.
You still rested, still mourned the small deaths that come with change, the loss of easy routines, the confusion when a path closed, the grief of leaving a former identity behind. But these losses were the price of entering a larger life, one that required courage and care. The rewards were not only material. They were the quiet mornings where you woke wanting to work, the inbox messages that read like gratitude, the community that bristled with life. You had become the lighthouse you once needed. You had learned to receive without shame and give without self-erasure. You had learned that creativity is not a hobby but a nervous system practice, a way to stay aligned. You had rewritten the good student's script into one of brave teaching, you had taught yourself to charge and to rest, you had traded the starving artist's myth for a thriving reality, you had stepped out from invisibility into a still, powerful light, you had stopped copying and started making.
Now the choice is quiet and immediate. You do not need another certificate to begin. You don't have to prove you're ready.
The work you were meant to do is already in your hands, threadbare and luminous, messy and true. Begin a small thing today, a page, a voice note, a letter to one person.
Offer it without expectation and watch the world answer in its own time.
The first step is never the last, but it is always the doorway. When you walk through it, life does not promise ease. It promises something truer, the slow, steady growth of a life that matches its soul.
Money follows. Freedom follows. Peace follows.
But before all of that comes the one thing you've been rehearsing for, the courage to be fully yourself.